On August 31st, 2022, I successfully defended my PhD thesis, completing a 5-year-long journey at Mcmaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. So I thought I'd make a bit of a reflection video about my time at Mcmaster, explain briefly the projects I worked on, the articles I put out, but most importantly, I'll try to explain how I grew as a physicist and how I changed my perspective over the years about being a physicist and being a successful physicist. Importantly, in the context of being a PhD student. I'll try to make things as self-contained as possible for this video, and if I do talk about a project, it will be in a very shallow way. I will skip over all of the technicalities throughout the video, so let me know if any topic seems interesting to you, and if you want it explored in more detail, let me know. Before we jump into it, I just wanted to plug my Discord channel, which is a small but growing community. We have channels for scientific computing, physics research, video discussions, and more. I respond much more quickly on Discord and usually in more detail. So if that sounds interesting to you, the link for that is in the description. I started my master's degree at Mcmaster 5 years ago after completing an undergraduate degree in applied mathematics and theoretical physics at Western University. At Western, I had great opportunities to work on research as an undergraduate student. My first supervisor at Western was the person which introduced me to my main topic of interest, which is the big picture question, how does thermodynamics emerge from quantum mechanics? This passion was kicked off specifically when I was introduced to the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. The ansatz basically guarantees that the dynamics of an isolated quantum system do in fact go to equilibrium that is well described by statistical mechanics, a common topic for most undergraduate physics students. There's definitely a lot to say about the ansatz on its own, and that could be its own video. I have 2 videos on it, and there could definitely be more. But basically what happened is that after introducing this ansatz to me, the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis, my supervisor and I in my undergraduate degree decided to embark on a research project looking at the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis in a specific class of models. Now, luckily for me, that turned into my first research article. Basically, what we showed is that a specific class of models that we were looking at satisfy the generalized form of the hypothesis, and basically this results from a nice counting problem, and then we also provided, or I provided, some computational results. So this was my first exposure to both computational and analytical research. For computations, I used Mathematica, which in hindsight for the problem I was looking at was exceptionally inefficient, or at least my Mathematica code was exceptionally inefficient. I'm sure a much more proficient Mathematica coder could have done my project much quicker. My supervisor was nice enough to make it a priority to publish with me before I left my undergraduate degree and moved on to my master's degree, which I'm very grateful for. The research experience accelerated my passion and focus for my current main research direction. It also made me want to pursue a research path that was split somewhat evenly between computational and analytical type arguments. And at the time, I felt like due to my undergraduate degree, both of these paths were not only possible, but areas that I could potentially thrive in. So with this project done, I headed off to Mcmaster University, sort of a bright-eyed master's student. The reason I chose Mcmaster was to work with my supervisor, Eric, specifically to become a strong computational physicist. At the beginning, I basically decided to put aside advancing my analytical skills in favor of my computational skills. On some level, this was a safety choice. I had always liked computational problems, and I felt like I could excel at it very quickly. So at the beginning of my master's, the plan was basically to continue to do research in my field of interest and learn strong numerical methods for the models I was interested in and the problems I was interested in. So at the time, before entering my master's degree, I was very excited and felt very ambitious. I also felt very safe in my plan to focus on computational physics. So unfortunately for me, as lots of stories go, Mcmaster somewhat had different plans for me. I wanted to hit the ground running, but if you watched my video on disability, you'll know that I get migraines quite frequently. This is a problem I can manage and live with, assuming I have the proper medication. Unfortunately, medication that was by default covered in my undergraduate institution was not covered at Mcmaster. What you had to do instead was apply for the medication to be covered and pay out of pocket until the insurance company made its choice about whether or not it was going to cover the medication you needed. Now, I was naive. I didn't realize this initially and ended up applying for coverage much too late. So there was quite the backlog of applications by the time that I submitted my application. I started my master's in September, and the medication wasn't covered until something like January. Now, the master's program that I was in, which is quite typical for Ontario, master's students take 4 classes in their 2-year program. Most students take all 4 courses their first year, so they can focus on research in the second year. So with how expensive my medication was, I didn't really have the resources to take it as much as I needed, and I unfortunately had to withdraw from a course in my first semester. So this put me behind my peers, which ended up stressing me out quite a bit. I also largely couldn't do research without my medication. The added stress of all of this also triggered more migraines, so it was definitely not a great time in my first year. But thankfully, the people in the physics department I interacted with to resolve this problem were really supportive, particularly my supervisor, Eric, and the graduate chair at the time. I didn't really enjoy my initial interactions with the institutional side of Mcmaster, as they more or less shrugged at my situation and let me go through the motions to get the medications that I needed. It was during this time, however, that my undergraduate supervisor, Marcus, made a trip out to the Perimeter Institute and invited me out to meet up with him. There, I was introduced to my now longtime collaborator, Alvaro, a postdoc at the time at the Perimeter Institute, and from then on, I went to the Perimeter Institute maybe 2 times a month on average to work the whole day with Alvaro. So this networking, or this work with Alvaro, gave me opportunities to work on analytical problems, as well as contribute to topics with my numerical work that I was already learning with my supervisor at Mcmaster. So this was an incredibly important opportunity for me to take advantage of. Luckily for me, Perimeter Institute sent a van Tuesdays and Friday mornings to pick up people from Mcmaster and bring them to PI, so traveling there was always easy. Alvaro has been and continues to be an important mentor and collaborator for me. And luckily for me, he wasn't the only mentor I met in this first year. At Mcmaster, I met several more senior graduate students who took an interest in me, showed me the ropes of the department, and were always available for advice. So in total, I would like to say at this point that if you are watching this now as someone 1 year in, 2 years, or more, you can make a huge impact on more junior graduate students' lives if you just make yourself approachable and offer advice and guidance to them. And on the flip side, if you are a newer student and have senior students or postdocs in your life, in your group, or in your vicinity, pick their brains, let them know through your actions that you are willing to listen to what they have to say, to learn from them, and so on. At the end of the day, these people represent a form of institutional memory for you, and you should access it if you have it available. In total, whether you're a senior person or a more junior person, don't be passive with your relationships. And this sort of goes with all research relationships. At the end of the day, physics is an extremely collaborative science. The more active you are in building relationships, the more opportunities you're going to have to collaborate and succeed in physics. So with that being said, there were lots of pluses and minuses starting out in my graduate school career. I definitely didn't get the start I wanted to as a student. The initial research direction I was started out in by my supervisor was to study something called many-body localization. This topic has continued to be quite a hot topic in the field. It's basically a type of phase of matter where it lacks transport, entanglement builds up quite slowly, and the eigenstate thermalization hypothesis is false. I did a video on Anderson localization, which is quite similar. So check that out if you're interested in that. We eventually moved into studying scrambling and out-of-time ordered correlators. Not to continuously plug different videos, but I also did a video on scrambling. But the gist of this type of problem is studying how information, or quantum information, is scrambled across the system. Information is conserved in quantum systems, so if we want our system to thermalize or go to an equilibrium that is well described by statistical mechanics, some type of erasing or scrambling of initial information needs to take place. We weren't making a lot of progress, so I ended up pushing for us to look at a model similar to the model from my first article with my undergraduate supervisor. Because in this model, things could be computed exactly, analytically for some cases, or larger system sizes could be investigated. This model is a free fermionic model. It's something called integrable. So it's an exactly solvable model. Most models don't have this property, which makes them very hard to work with. To be honest, this choice was motivated by the fact that I wanted to make quicker progress. I lost a lot of time to being sick and not having medicine. I just wanted to finish a project or feel like I was close to finishing a project. So with this project in this new direction, we eventually published our first article together, which was quite timely, finishing it up around the end of my first year. Over this first year, I picked up a few numerical techniques like parallel computing and getting very comfortable with C++, and specifically the Eigen C++ library for linear algebra. Now, of course, at the same time, I was taking courses. To be honest, the courses I took are somewhat of a blur. I took statistical mechanics, high-performance computing, and numerical analysis in my first year. I definitely stand by those choices. I think everyone in scientific computing should take a few numerical analysis courses to try and wrap your head around when and why certain types of errors can come up. It definitely speeds up your debugging time, and it adds a lot of skills to your tool belt. So going into the second year of my master's, research with Alvaro had definitely picked up. We were working on an article and a research line with another postdoc named Luis Pedro, and I was following up on my first article with Eric with another similar project, now in the Aubrey-Andre model. I also took a course called Advanced Statistical Mechanics, which basically covered phase transitions and classical field theory in detail, which was very cool. Second year, I was also in the groove of getting my medication covered much earlier. Unfortunately, every single year I had to renew my medication coverage, but after the lesson learned in first year, I was much more on the ball for all the following years. In hindsight, in this time, I was offered a fair amount of chances to join reading groups in second year, and I turned it down because it wasn't immediately relevant to me. I had my models, I had my questions, and I had my active projects that looked promising. But this may have been a little bit of a mistake. The reading groups were relatively low commitment, and they definitely would have made me a better rounded physicist much faster. I guess my key takeaway from these years might be to not be overly afraid to learn new things. I guess it's not always obvious what to put your focus on, but at the very least, every new project in code, I tried to learn new coding practices and features, along with new physics and analytics. I'm not sure if my approach was optimal, and everyone will experience growing pains at different stages, but you should attempt to be constantly growing as a researcher. And I definitely turned down chances to do that, but I also prioritize that in other circumstances. So I can't say what I did was optimal, but I definitely think it's something you should have in the back of your mind. Sometimes growing as a physicist is more important than getting your results out quicker. It was also about this time where I got very good advice from a more senior student about work-life balance. So at the time, I was more or less working unless I had a social commitment. I was never so focused that I would turn down social commitments for work or anything like that, but I certainly wasn't taking breaks and making sure I didn't burn myself out. So the work-life balance talk was quite nice and very useful. I have since tried to maintain a relatively consistent schedule and making sure I take nights off to spend time with family and friends, or just doing something relaxing so that I don't get burnt out. At the end of the second year, I wrote my master's thesis and defended. Despite feeling proud of this accomplishment, I definitely knew that I needed to grow a lot as a researcher. I had 3 articles to my name, 2 of which were studying free fermionic models, and 1 studying more generic models using analytical techniques. On some level, I felt like I didn't do what I came to Mcmaster to do, and that was to learn harder computational methods. So the overarching plan for my PhD after that was to try not to rely too much on free fermionic models, not to rely too much on my previous experience in different techniques, and instead to push my boundaries for new projects. The first year of my PhD, I took 2 reading courses, one reading the book Geometry of Quantum States, and the other on quantum thermodynamics. Project-wise, I was learning a lot, pushing my boundaries, but largely my first year of my PhD was marked by a lot of unsuccessful and abandoned project ideas. I had in my mind at the time a publish or perish mentality, always trying to be better than the previous year, but that just wasn't in the cards at the time. I wasn't ready, my bag of tricks was too small, and deep down I knew that, but in the end it was really good to struggle during this year. To struggle specifically with those ideas of publish or perish. I learned a lot, and I ended up learning how to give myself more realistic expectations. Eventually, Alvaro and Luis Pedro came up with another really cool project idea, and when they were chatting about it with me, I more or less asked if they'd be patient while I wrote a big exact diagonalization code to support the project. It was sort of the perfect storm. The project needed a fair amount of numerics, and I wanted the time and the space to develop a new exact diagonalization code with a specific project in mind for that code. So the way you write these exact diagonalization codes, you eventually want to account for several symmetries in the model to allow you to access bigger system sizes. So I initially gave results in a more naive code to them, then slowly worked my way up to including new symmetries one by one, slowly accessing bigger and bigger system sizes. It was sort of the end of my first year as a PhD student, and there were going to be a few interruptions along the way to completing the code, unfortunately. By far the biggest interruption was comprehensive exams that I had to do in February of my second year. Comprehensive exams for physics at Mcmaster entail basically receiving 3 to 4 books, assigned reading in these books, and then several months later, you give a brief research talk to an examining committee, and then you give an oral examination out of these resources that you were given prior. I more or less stopped all research to prepare for this exam. I still coded a bit, but basically from September till February, this exam was my only focus. Conventional wisdom that was passed on to me was you should start studying in December or November, but with my migraines, I can have months at a time where my productivity is very low, so I didn't have the luxury of planning that. I just studied whenever I could study. I had a book on quantum information, a book on statistical physics, a book on condensed matter physics, and a review article from my field. At the time, it felt like quite the cool process, especially reading the condensed matter physics book. I hadn't taken a course in condensed matter physics formally, and was enjoying all of the background reading. I also learned some new StatMech topics, which was quite nice. Over time, however, I got pretty bored and was pretty done with it. To be honest, I decided to start this YouTube channel almost as revenge against comprehensive exams. I couldn't study what I wanted to study, so I made a YouTube channel where I get to talk about whatever physics that I want to specifically talk about. The exam itself went really well. My big trip up was I didn't prioritize the classical results in the condensed matter physics textbook. Instead, I focused almost entirely on the quantum mechanical side of the textbook. Also, I was asked a lot of questions that were to intuitively explain why certain things scaled in certain ways. And I had a few back and forths where I was more or less like, listen, I can derive this for you, and the examiner would ask for intuition, and so on. Once the exam was over, I was really motivated to start the YouTube channel and finish my exact diagonalization code. I was also able to get a fun collaboration with two researchers at Mcmaster, resulting in a new article along with my supervisor, Eric. Once the exact diagonalization code was done, I also put out a new article with Alvaro and Luis Pedro. So year 2 was pretty jam-packed in my PhD, finishing my code, getting 2 articles on the books, and doing comprehensive exams. At the beginning of my 3rd year, I wanted to learn even more numerical techniques. Exact diagonalization can only get you so far. So I ventured to learn tensor network type algorithms, along with getting more involved in my supervisor's ground state physics and phase transition oriented research. While I tried several algorithms and got familiar with the iTensor library for C++, I definitely still feel like a beginner. I'm not very confident in it. I did contribute quite a bit to a project with density matrix renormalization group calculations. Going into 3rd year, I had a pretty relaxed mood, sort of wanting to expand my horizons and up my game a bit. So I was exploring some analytics, being more experimental with the questions I was asking and the things that I was learning. Progress wasn't exactly straightforward, but at least this year I had felt a lot more comfortable with taking my time. I intended to graduate at the end of my 4th year, so I wasn't too worried about the fact that I was exploring more. But then I got forwarded an email, a postdoc position talking about all of my favorite research questions to work at the University of Nottingham. This was, I think, maybe in March or so, quite late in the academic year. As I had said previously, I had no intention at this stage to graduate, but I applied anyway to see, not really expecting to get the position. I eventually received an email saying that I was shortlisted and they wanted to interview me. Then during the interview, I have to say, I had a feeling it went really well. And then, shortly after, I got the offer. My wife and I decided that I should take the job offer. It was and is an awesome opportunity for me. And to be honest, I've never lived outside of Southern Ontario, so definitely an adventure as well. But I was stuck with somewhat of a logistical problem. I now had to write a PhD thesis to graduate in time to take the job. A thesis I hadn't planned. So usually to write what's called a sandwich thesis, you need 3 articles. So the sandwich thesis is significantly easier to write than a regular thesis. So I decided that I needed a quick article. Lucky for me, Alvaro and I, along with a new collaborator, Nathan, who is a good friend from my undergrad, had some rough results that we were talking about and that were in preparation. So quickly, this turned into a nice article on quantum equilibration and recurrences. They worked quite hard with me to get this article out on time, so I'm quite grateful for that. So once this article was more or less finished, I got working on my thesis, in particular the introduction to my thesis, because the body of the thesis would just be my 3 research articles. I decided that I wanted to be a bit ambitious. I wanted to present an argument, start to finish, to construct statistical mechanics from unitary dynamics. I had talked about it sort of piece by piece, separately on the YouTube channel, talked about it at length with colleagues about it, and so on. I just wanted to present some sort of perhaps my own formulation of how to get statistical mechanics, or maybe not my own formulation, but sort of how I do it in my head, or my favorite way to explain it. So James, who has been on the stream a few times, jokingly calls it epistemic statistical mechanics because we arrive at the ensembles of statistical mechanics through Jane's principle. I had to have the thesis submitted 6 weeks prior to my defense, and I defended on August 31st. I did take quite a bit of time off after my thesis was submitted. I went to a concert, visited family and friends, and overall tried to relax. But then, after a little bit, it was time to start studying for the exam again. I wanted to be familiar with as much literature as I could be in time for the defense. In the defense, I had two committee members, Duncan and Sungsik, who had been with me from when I started as my committee members. I met with them roughly once a year for 5 years. I also had my supervisor Eric there and another professor from the university who chaired the defense. But interestingly, I also had an external examiner, which made the defense really fun. I was lucky enough to have a large amount of friends and family show up to my defense. It was a bit of a public spectacle. I was quite nervous for the defense, but it went really well. Lots of good dialogue, potential new research questions, and so on. I'm definitely grateful for that experience. It was actually a really fun time, despite how nervous I was for it. And that's basically the story of my graduate school, sort of summarized in a really quick manner. There were many ups and downs, significant changes to my outlook on physics and education. A big one that I haven't had a chance to mention or fit into the story is more or less about marking undergraduate assignments. My undergrad sort of baked this pride into me that I survived these bottleneck courses. And as I TA'd, and as I thought more about my struggles with the academic system that was quite inflexible for my disability, I relaxed my take on this a little bit. The overly harsh marking schemes don't really seem to help anyone. And to be honest, the difficult courses I taught were difficult largely because they were either too ambitious in material or poorly structured for the student's background. So in the end, it didn't make sense to overly punish anyone. There were definitely a lot of ups and downs in my confidence, being tempted to either drop out or look for work in industry once I had finished. There were times when I felt like I just wasn't cut out for physics, or perhaps that it just wasn't worth it. I think these feelings are pretty normal, and I benefited from having a very supportive family, plus a very supportive supervisor and a cast of senior graduate students and postdocs. I am now moving on to my next chapter, which is a postdoc at Nottingham University. As you can tell by my background, I've already moved. Since this story has featured lots of goals and revisions to goals, it wouldn't be complete without me telling you what my plans are for this year. The contract I have is 2 years, which means I have roughly a year to prepare for the next round of applications. The exciting part about this postdoc is there is no teaching, so I can entirely focus on being a productive researcher, so that's obviously my plan. I want to generalize my code to handle a larger class of models. I want to be an efficient researcher this year, hopefully having more time to read new articles coming out, proposing more research directions, and I of course want to improve my publication rate, or at the very least the rate at which I produce results that can go into articles. I also want to continue to grow the YouTube channel and make more videos for it. The move and finishing my PhD have made things very slow for YouTube, but hopefully with all this freedom that I now have, the end result will be in more videos and hopefully higher quality videos. But that's it for this particular video. Hopefully this rant somehow is helpful to someone. If you liked the video, feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below.